Welcome, everyone. Our participants are joining. We'll get started in just a moment. All right, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's talk and event titled Distributed Humanitarianism, Digital Disruption and Poland's Aid to Ukraine. My name is Cassandra Hartley. I'll be the chair for today's event. I am the director of the Center for Global Disability Studies at the University of Toronto and an assistant professor in the Department of Health and Society at the University of Toronto Scarborough, as well as holding graduate appointments in the Department of Anthropology and the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. Our event today is hosted by the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Toronto and the Petro Yacyk Program for the Study of Ukraine. So as a brief access note, if you're finding your way around the Zoom, we do have AI live captions enabled, which you may need to click on the three dots that say more to find. Then you can click show subtitle. If you'd like to ask a question for the panelists, please use the Q&A function and we will collect some questions and look forward to getting to them as we head toward the end of the talk. I'd also like to acknowledge that the land on which the University of Toronto operates for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this is a meeting place to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island and urban Indigenous communities, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land and the virtual connection to many colonized homelands where we're all joining from. So now I will gladly introduce our panelists. Today's talk has been prepared by Elizabeth Cullen-Dunn and Ivana Kulishevska. Elizabeth Cullen-Dunn is professor of geography and the director for the Center for Refugee Studies at Indiana University Bloomington. She has conducted her research on Poland since 1992, and her first book, Privatizing Poland, was awarded the Orbis Book Prize and was also a noteworthy book in my own graduate education. Her latest book, No Path Home, looks at the failure of humanitarian aid in the wake of the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008. Her current research, funded by the National Science Foundation, focuses on humanitarian labor, including volunteer action and the role of refugee resettlement agencies in agricultural labor markets. Ivana Kulishevska is an assistant professor at the Institute of Ethnology and Cultural Anthropology, University of Warsaw. She's been researching the North Caucasus since 2004. Her most recent study focuses on corruption, Islamic economics, and radicalism. She has authored numerous publications about the Caucasus and co-directed a documentary about the Dagestani female wrestler entitled The Strong Woman from 2014. She is the editor and co-founder of the Kaukaz.net website, K-A-U-K-A-Z, and foundation, and has been traveling around Russia, Central Asia, and the Caucasus since 1999. So Ivana is not able to join us at this moment as she is actually actively in the field. And I'm very grateful to both of our presenters for pulling together a talk on unfolding research and a very intense topic at a time when all of these events are in progress and very much unfolding. So without further ado, I will now hand it over to Dr. Elizabeth Cullen-Dunn.
Thank you so much for having me today. I appreciate the chance to talk about this. And I want to signal that although Ivana is not here, she is definitely one of the driving forces behind this talk, and this is very much her intellectual work. So I want to share that. What I would like to do is share my screen so that you can see this, and then we can sort of talk our way through it. As you know, the war in Ukraine now is in about its 40th day. I think we're on day 41 of the war, but that's actually a mistake in saying that. This is a war that has been brewing for 14 years since the Budapest Declaration of 2008, which was followed by the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008. And at that time, Michał Saakashvili, the president of Georgia, said that Ukraine would be next. And it took longer than anyone thought, but certainly this is a war that has been going in slow-mo since the Russian invasion of Crimea and the Donbass in 2014. And now we are starting to see some of the horrific events that have happened in the wake of that invasion and the incredible savagery and brutality of this war. So in what I talk about today, I'm talking about the humanitarian response for people who have left Ukraine and have gone into Poland. Right now, UNHCR, that's the UN's High Commission for Refugees, estimates that about 4 million people have left Ukraine. There are another 7 million people who are internally displaced inside Ukraine. And last night, Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, advised people from Donbass and from Kharkiv to evacuate as soon as possible. So we are expecting a wave of several million more people who will be internally displaced or who will cross the border. Of the 4 million people who have crossed so far, about 3 million of them have come into Poland. And some of them have fanned outwards into the rest of Europe, but many of them have stayed inside Poland. And this is, of course, in terms of numbers, the biggest refugee crisis that we have seen in Europe since the end of World War II. So the scale and the magnitude of this crisis is something we have not seen in our lifetimes. And as many of you have seen, the response in Poland has been overwhelming. Millions of people have come forward to volunteer to help people crossing the border. And you see it at each border crossing. If you go to the border crossing in Medica, for example, there's kind of a long chute that the sidewalk that people come down, and it's almost a strangely festival atmosphere with volunteers offering everything from soup to pancakes. There's an American guy who has been making pancakes for 3 weeks and giving them out to kids. Volunteer firefighters, the women's rural, let's see, how do I say it? The Women's Rural Association, rural circles, have been providing vat after vat of soup to every person who crosses the border. And so we've seen the residents of the villages along the border providing an enormous amount of aid. In Warsaw, at Warsaw Central Station, thousands of volunteers have descended. They're providing meals, they're providing SIM cards, they're providing transport onwards. So we have seen just an overwhelming response from the Polish people. And as I'll talk about, the majority of this is self-organized. It's not organized through an NGO. It's not organized by the government. It's an entirely volunteer response, which has helped over 3 million people as they move into or through Poland. And right now, we believe there's about 2 million people from Ukraine inside Poland who will be there for the duration of the war. So we're trying to ask a really important set of questions. Sorry, I'm flipping back and forth between the slides because I've organized them in different ways. But one of the things that has happened is that we've seen this remarkable difference in the way that the response has been handled, because traditionally humanitarian response is handled by the UN agencies, particularly the UN High Commission for Refugees and the International Organization for Migration, as well as other UN agencies like UNICEF, UNIFEM, UNDP, and so on. And they are the hub around which a constellation of national governments, like the United States' USAID is usually involved in these responses. The Czech Republic will send People in Need, which is its national development agency. And along with them, there's also an enormous constellation of international NGOs that usually shows up. So Save the Children, World Vision, Church World Service, and other large international aid agencies show up at these emergencies. And this has not happened in Poland. in fact, we took a picture. This is at Budimir crossing, so right across the border. We're about 100 yards across the border here. And we took a picture of this tent every day for 11 days, and it was empty for 11 days. So we did not see UNHCR until the last day of our trip, and I was there March 9th to March 25th, and we did not see any sign of UNHCR until the last day. We did not see any sign of IOM except for one training they held for 12 people, all volunteers. It was psychosocial aid training for people who did not speak Ukrainian or Russian. So this is one of the first major refugee displacements in which the international aid system, as it was constituted after 1951, is not involved. And so my question then is this: is this form of what we're calling distributed humanitarianism signaling a digital disruption of the humanitarian aid industry, much in the way that music or journalism have themselves been transformed by internet-mediated activity? Should we think about this as what I'm going to argue is a post-Fordist form of humanitarian aid? And then the question is, does this form of distributed humanitarianism indicate for us a new era after neoliberalism? So is it post-neoliberal in important ways? And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think this means in terms of social organization more widely. So as I mentioned, Ivana and I spent about 14 days in the field, primarily we went to 4 border crossings, but primarily we were at Budomir, Korchova, and Medica. We also were at 3 transit stations: Przemyśl, Warsaw's East Station, and Warsaw Central Station. And we spent time in shelters in Warsaw and in Przemyśl, including one in an old Tesco, and one in a place called Młyny, which is just outside the Korchova crossing. So we went to a wide variety of sites, and all of them were being 100% run by volunteers. The only international NGO we saw on the ground arrived about the 20th of March, and that was World Central Kitchen. They provide hot meals to people crossing the border. So I want to break the talk into 4 sections. First, I'm going to talk about the standard humanitarian aid system as it was developed after 1951. Then I'm going to introduce what I think is a new form of humanitarian aid, distributed humanitarianism. I'll talk about some of the benefits of that and also some of the problems, and then wrap up a little bit by talking about what I think that this form of humanitarian means more generally. So let me start by talking about the post-1951 system. The 1951 UN Convention on Refugees outlines who exactly comes under the United Nations mandate to help displaced people. And the 1951 Convention also outlines what are other states' responsibilities for the protection of refugees and what the UN system itself must do to assist displaced people. This is a system that was built to respond to the massive movement of now stateless people in Europe after World War II. And in fact, originally the 1951 Convention was limited only to Europeans. It wasn't amended to incorporate Palestinians until the mid-1950s. The system itself stems from a famous problem as it was posed by Hannah Arendt, who said that when you are expelled from your state, you no longer have the rights of a citizen. You're forced to rely only on human rights. And she argues that without anyone to enforce those rights, a displaced person has no rights at all. She famously said that you'd be better off being a criminal, because at least then you'd have a place in the judicial system. So one of the things the UN system was not designed to do was to try and uphold the rights of people who had only human rights. But when it designed this system, the architecture of the whole system was designed around the dominant mode of production in the mid-20th century, which was Fordist mass production. Fordism, the goal of Fordism is to produce as many standardized units of something as you can in order to reduce the cost per unit. And this economy of scale ended up being the secret to the production of massive quantities of automobiles, tractors, houses, and so on in the 20th century. It was the key to our entire system of mass consumption. The humanitarian system, as it was designed, was in many ways no different. It was based on using mass production to gain an economy of scale. So what happens is that, and this is still the system, the United Nations gathers money from foreign governments and other donors via what it calls a flash appeal. And so what you have then is a big pool of common money, which is divided among UN agencies who either themselves buy a large quantity of identical goods and move it out in trucks, or they subcontract to international NGOs who do much the same thing. They buy in bulk and they deliver, 10,000 blankets, 10,000 cots, and so on. One of the reasons, or one of the outcomes of a system of mass production is that the humanitarian system needed a central location where it could deliver all this stuff, right? In order to have the mass consumption of humanitarian aid, you have to have a mass of people to deliver to. And the answer then was the formation of the refugee camp. The refugee camp is not designed necessarily in the interest of refugees, who are often marooned in these camps far away from labor markets. So they can't get jobs, they can't provide for themselves. Often the camps are closed and refugees are forbidden to leave them. What they are is designed for the convenience of nation states who can contain these mobile populations and prevent them from entering their labor markets. And they're designed for the convenience of aid agencies who have a single point of delivery for the mass-produced goods that they're bringing. So this is a system that is designed for a kind of mass efficiency, but in fact leads to a lot of problems. It's extremely rigid and it's extremely slow. Because it involves so many large bureaucratic actors, it can take weeks or months for the aid system as a whole to respond to an emergency. And this is indeed what we've seen in this emergency. I am not sure why the international aid system is not active in Georgia, but or in Poland, I'm sorry. I don't know if it has to do with the Polish government not wanting them there. But I do know that even in Moldova, Romania, Slovakia, other countries on the border, the international aid system was caught by surprise. They've said that themselves. They were caught by surprise. They weren't prepared to deploy inside Europe. And so it took them a long time. So you can see that the World Food Program, which is the largest deliverer of food to displaced people in the world, could not deliver food into Ukraine until March the 15th, which was 20 days into the war. HIAS, which is a Jewish aid agency, did not post an ad for a response coordinator until March the 30th. I'm sorry, March the 26th, which was already 32 days into the war. So these agencies have been very slow to respond, and the funding process for them is also quite slow, despite the fact it's called a flash appeal. So to set up the chains of subcontracting that are needed to get aid to where it needs to go takes time, and that's time that displaced people don't have. By day 25 of the war, more than 2 million people had already left Ukraine. And those people were not receiving aid at all, either from the Polish national government or from international aid agencies. In fact, by March 30, the only project that UNHCR had running in Poland was a cash assistance program where they were giving out Visa cards loaded with cash. And that benefited only 4,000 people. of the 2 million people who had entered by that point. So we have a lot of rigidity and slowness. There's a bottleneck problem. If at some point in the chain of production or warehousing or transport, something shuts down, a road, a financial mechanism, the whole aid system can grind to a halt because it's so highly centralized. There is a dramatic lack of responsiveness to what people need on the ground. The international aid system is notorious for just repurposing standardized programs. And the anthropologist Peter Redfield has written a lot about this. He calls these kits. But these kits are just deployed in different places regardless of context. So we saw that in the 2008 invasion of Georgia. I saw a proposal by an aid agency which had clearly been designed, it was a breastfeeding support program, clearly been designed for the Congo. Because while they had replaced the word Congo with the word Georgia, they had forgotten to replace the word Congolese with the word Georgian. So the proposal itself contained the word Congolese, and it was talking about an infrastructure that was clearly about a third world country, whereas Georgia had running water and available infant formula and widespread breastfeeding throughout the entire crisis. So the idea of programs themselves as kits, which are moved from place to place regardless of context, is extremely problematic when you're talking about aid inside highly developed Western Europe. And the fact that people have different needs on the ground there is not something that the aid system can handle very quickly. Finally, the traditional aid system has a huge problem with cost efficiency and overhead. Because of the chain of subcontracting, each level takes a cut for overhead. So for example, if there's funding that's coming from UNHCR, UNHCR is taking overhead. It's subcontracting to, say, Care International, which is taking overhead for its services, which is then subcontracting to a local partner. I prefer the word subcontractor, which itself is taking a cut. And what we found is that on average, only about 37 cents on the dollar of aid actually reaches refugees. So the legacy system that we have is highly inefficient, and it just couldn't move fast enough to help people leaving Ukraine and entering Poland. So inside Poland, we've seen this distributed humanitarian response, which has been very, very different. At one level, there has been a very fast response by national level NGOs inside Poland. So the big ones, Grupa Granica, which had already mobilized to help Syrians on the Belarusian border in a process where they really opposed the Polish government, and many of them have now been arrested and are facing prison terms for that aid. Fundacja Ocalenia, which has been involved helping the 1.8 million Ukrainians who have entered Poland since 2014, that is before this war. They were highly activated. Polska Akcja Humanitarna is another major NGO in Poland which has responded. And the fact that they already had a developed information infrastructure was extremely helpful in mobilizing people. We've also seen a lot of highly localized organizations, that is super subnational organizations. And here I'm thinking about this group called the Koło Gospodyń Wiejskich, which is the Rural Women's Circles. This is an organization founded in 1918 that survived all the way through the communist period, and it's organized at the village level. So when we were at a transit shelter called the Hala Kijowska in Młyny, we saw that women from the Koło Gospodyń Wiejskich were arriving day after day after day with these vats of soup. And we asked them how they were organizing it. And they said that each village had been assigned a day, and women would prepare meals and bring them in, hot meals for thousands of people per day. And for the first almost 30 days of the war, they were the major food provider for people in transit in the border region. So these tiny little groups of village women were feeding tens of thousands of people. The other group that we saw working really very fast and very efficiently was the Straż Pożarna, which is the volunteer firefighters. And they were also organized at the gmina level in Poland, which is a collection of villages. So at a very, very local level. And they were providing almost all of the transport for people from the border to onward transportation at the Przemyśl train station, or transporting directly to Warsaw or to Krakow in buses. So they were extremely active. And, you know, we're asking now if it was the local government that activated them. But in the interviews we had, it looks like they activated themselves and then later told the gmina government and the voivode government, which is the regional government, what they were doing. So it was very much self-organized, self-activated. And then we have individual volunteers who aren't affiliated with any group. So these folks, for example, came down from Bydgoszcz. They loaded their camper van full of coffee and milk and cookies. There was so much junk food going around. And they brought them down, loaded it at their own expense, came down to the border, set up outside a transit shelter, and were offering these things around the clock to aid people who were arriving at the border, from the border at different points. These volunteers make up the absolute bulk of the response, and it's been millions of people. And in many ways, it's been incredible to watch these new networks of solidarity forming in the instant, right? These aren't people who knew each other before, but they're creating chains where they're helping each other and passing Ukrainians almost from hand to hand, from helper to helper, to help them get wherever they're going. These are more individual volunteers who showed up. And I was going to show you one other picture, which I thought was really interesting, but a lot of these volunteers are organizing themselves online. And so I think I have a slide coming up in which I'll show you how they do that. But for example, there's a Facebook group called Pomoc dla Ukrainy, which has over 500,000 people as members, and they are self-organizing the help that is needed on Facebook and showing up to deliver it. So what we have then is basically, instead of centralized humanitarian services, which are being managed by, say, the United Nations OCHA, which is the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, what we're seeing is this widely distributed network of self-organized action that is happening through thousands, if not millions, of different channels on a daily basis. And Ivana and I started thinking about this in terms of computer science metaphors, because she has a degree in computer science, actually. And we were thinking about this as a kind of, not just internet mediated, but a social network which takes on the form of the internet, which takes on the form of distributed computing. So a distributed network is a type of computer network that's spread over different machines. So it provides a single data communication network, which can be managed either separately or jointly by sub-networks. Besides shared communication, a distributed network also distributes the work of computing. It distributes its processing. So here we have a technique of linking together multiple computer servers over a network into a cluster to share data and to coordinate their processing power. And in the case of the volunteers who were showing up physically with physical goods for refugees, we had the same thing happening. We had individual volunteers and small groups who were coordinated by actual distributed computing networks. And here you can see several kinds of them. The Pomoc dla Ukrainy group, just the Warsaw group alone had 26,000 members. That's just Warsaw. When we stole this slide 2 weeks ago, today it had almost 50,000 members. And they were doing really interesting work managing not only the flow of people and of money, but also the flow of goods. So the idea of a virtual warehouse emerged. And this is this Wirtualny Magazyn Bez Granic. There are several of these. Instead of holding all of these donated goods together in a warehouse, which is A, expensive, and B, increase your shipping costs dramatically, and C, makes it so that you don't necessarily have what people need when they need it. A virtual warehouse is where different shelters and transit sites are posting their needs, and individual volunteers are bringing those objects to the shelters as they go. So for example, when Warsaw Central Station needs toothpaste to hand out, they post in the virtual warehouse, toothpaste needed, and thousands of volunteers will show up with boxes of toothpaste. And I watch it happen. You can put out a call and receive the goods you need within an hour. I mean, it was amazing. It was faster than Amazon. This virtual warehouse meant that there were no costs of storage or transit, that the sites of distribution were getting what they needed to distribute almost in a just-in-time fashion. We also saw this organized on Twitter through hashtags, other kinds of social media groups. There were Telegram groups. So there were many, many different channels through which this was happening. The interesting thing about this is, instead of gathering all the resources and money and people into a single organization, millions of people from around the world could enter into this system and help. So there's another Facebook group I really like called Transport a Sister. And it's an offshoot of what was just a travel and hosting group called Give a Sister a Ride, I think is what it was called. And Transport a Sister, they post needs that Ukrainian families have to be moved, say, from Warsaw to Berlin or Warsaw to Vancouver. And people from around the world can jump in, buy tickets, arrange for tickets using airline miles, and book them in the name of the family that needs them and move that family out in very short order. And that site alone has moved tens of thousands of people in need of transport onwards. So where Fordist humanitarianism needed the physical space of the camp in order to bring the aid providers, and the beneficiaries all together, today this is being done exclusively online. And the result has been that there are no refugee camps in Poland. People who come into these large transit centers will sometimes enter a space where 1,500, 2,000 people are sleeping, but they're there for 48 hours, a couple of days, until they can arrange onward transport to a place where they have a host family, or they have relatives, or they have a place they can stay for longer term. What this means then for the UN system is that it is no longer the coordinator of humanitarian action. Instead of a single path for money to flow through and labor to be organized, instead of the flash appeal being the coordinating mechanism, or the cluster system, which is the UN's process for organizing many NGOs for one emergency. Instead of the cluster system being the mechanism for arranging all this, now there are literally thousands of paths for helpers, people in need of help, and the resources that they need to come together. And you can see here's a transit station in which all the blankets are different because there was a call out for blankets and people brought blankets. Here's another space in the transit station where people were staying just for a few days at a time. And sorry, these are the soup givers, the volunteer firefighters. At the Hala Kioska where I was staying, it was one of the amazing things was that huge 18-wheelers of privately organized aid were being driven up, and stuff was being dropped by the pallet load in the parking lot. So we had actually mountains of diapers, literally 10 or 12 feet high, mountains of clothing, mountains of blankets that were being brought. Actually, the volume became really overwhelming. And here you can see volunteers. This is also the Polish National Guard was activated to try and just sort some of the donations. Here's volunteers loading people into private cars to transport them onwards. And one of our friends has organized, I helped organize some money for this. She's organized a van, and they have been running back and forth from Mannheim, Germany to Warsaw every 2 days for the last month. And all of the funding for that has been privately organized on Facebook. I'll give another quick example about this. I put out a call on my own Facebook page saying, hey friends, I'm going to the border. If you want to send me some cash, I'll distribute it directly to refugees who need it. And I figured I'd get like 800, $1,000 bucks, which is what I usually get when I run a fundraiser. I got $38,000, which I have been able to forward on both to people in Poland, and we have now started buying medical supplies to bring directly into Ukraine. I talked to another man who was the owner of a liquid natural gas company that was working in Ukraine. He himself is from Washington State. And he organized in the first week of the war, $2 million worth of aid that he organized himself and drove in himself with his business partner in the first 7 days of the war. And he tells the story about how he did it. It was a Sunday, and he got to Rzeszów, Poland, which has kind of been the nearest major hub to the border, and got a guy who owned a medical supply store to open up on a Sunday. And they were basically emptying the store into trucks when the man said to him, well, how are you going to pay me? It's a Sunday. You can't do a wire transfer on a Sunday. And Dale said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a cash deposit in dollars. And then tomorrow morning, I'll come back. You give me back my cash deposit in dollars, and I'll make the wire transfer. And so he walked out to his car, and he brought back in $100,000 in US bills, wrapped in bricks of money, and dropped $100,000 on this store owner's desk, loaded the trucks, drove them into Ukraine, and came back the next morning to do a wire transfer. And they moved 2 million in supplies the first week of the war, and now have moved another $900,000 in aid into Ukraine in food. And that's all privately organized by one person. So the response has been really amazing. It has been faster. First of all, it's been much faster than the traditional humanitarian response. I mean, this guy brought in $2 million of aid in 5 days. The UN could not do that. But the distributed humanitarian system has several other really interesting aspects to it. One is that it's scalable. That is, it can get bigger and smaller as is needed, because the call for volunteers can go out. Telling people, okay, enough volunteers at this place, go to that place. Or we don't need volunteers today, we need them tomorrow. And now we're seeing where the big push was to have volunteers and material show up at transit hubs. Now we're seeing, for example, small shops being opened in abandoned spaces all throughout Warsaw, where Ukrainians can come in and shop for free. And the virtual warehouse puts out a call for buckwheat groats, and somebody will show up with bags and bags of buckwheat groats, which are given out until they're out. And then the call goes out again and people bring more food. So we're seeing this kind of fragmentation into new spaces with new kinds of aid happening as the response becomes scalable and divisible into micro spaces rather than being concentrated in a single space. We've seen that the new humanitarian system is much more responsive to need. So one of the things that was really interesting was watching the response of aid to children. So in the first days after the war, Poles brought an enormous amount of candy and sweets for kids. And we saw these kids who had now been living like 3 days on straight sugar and who were flying off the walls. And mothers were starting to say, hey, the kids need real food now. And the switchover was so fast and so amazing that when the call at the Hala Kiovska, where I was put out for healthy food instead of junk food, all of a sudden we started receiving thousands of pouches of like squeezable applesauce and other fruits for kids. So it's not just the volume of flow that can be changed on a dime, it's also the kind of flow. It's what's being offered can change very fast in response to actual needs. The system is also extremely resilient in a way the UN system isn't. In computing, they call this fault tolerance. That is, if one computer or one connection fails, the whole system doesn't go down. The system routes around the blockade, going through other pathways to maintain service. So you don't have the bottlenecking problem. In Fordist humanitarianism, bottlenecking is a huge problem. We've seen this, for example, with the International Committee of the Red Cross, which was trying to organize the evacuation of Mariupol as soon as that was possible. And the ICRC has announced that it would not. It tried on 2 occasions to get in, said that the Russians would not guarantee the safety of their aid workers, and so there was not going to be an evacuation. And yet 200,000 people have left Mariupol on buses and private transport organized by volunteers. We think there's still about 100,000 people left in the city. So right now, even though the United Nations system is currently controlling $427 million in funding, they have one project inside Poland to serve the now 3 million people who are there. The funding has been bottlenecked by politics, I think, and without permission to operate, UNHCR can't operate. The same thing happens when military issues. If a road is bombed, if a truck route is blockaded, the World Food Program can't get in with 18-wheelers. And we found that distributing food aid inside Ukraine with large trucks is very difficult because they're easy targets for bombing. So what's happening is that volunteers are sending that food in, instead of in one truck, they're sending it in multiple Sprinter van loads full of food. And those vans are more agile, they're less predictable, they're harder to get through. And if one of them is stopped, there are 15 more coming behind it in different routes that could get in. So the volunteer coordination of food is not bottlenecked in the same way that the World Food Program could be bottlenecked. And finally, the system as a whole is highly tolerant to disaster. So if there is a bomb, or if one city shuts down, if one route into a city shuts down, the whole system can adapt quickly to bring in what is needed. And one last thing, the system's super cost effective, right? So there's very low overhead. Volunteers are donating their resources and they're not charging for distribution. We're not charging for staff time to sort it. We don't have costs for accounting, tracking, warehousing. We don't have the cost to print report to donors, glossy 4-color brochures or PowerPoint shows. There's no post-program evaluation costs. There's no pre-program needs assessment costs. So the system as a whole is extremely, extremely efficient. But as great as this system is, and actually I have to say this is the most amazing, most efficient system for humanitarian response I've ever seen. And this is not my first emergency, this is my 5th. I also worked with Syrians in Greece, Syrians in Germany. I was part of the Afghan evacuation, and I worked at Camp Atterbury when the Afghans arrived to US military bases. This is the fastest, most efficient mobilization of resources I've ever seen. But it is not without faults. The first fault is that it really only works in a particular context. It only works in a comparatively rich country, because otherwise you don't have this broad base of people who can donate at a micro scale, but a lot of them can do the donation. So just as an example, the $38,000 I've collected, the largest single donation was $1,000. And the majority of donations were in the $100 to $200 range. You have to have people that can donate $100 or $200 or some small amount of money, but you need a lot of them. And that's unlikely to happen, say, in Somalia. The system requires a pre-existing infrastructure. It requires some existing volunteer groups. It requires the internet itself. It requires Facebook to function. So we're seeing that that infrastructure makes it only possible in some locations. The fact that you have these pre-existing groups also means that you have some experienced base of organizers where the experienced organizers are doing very difficult jobs. For example, extracting people who need to be extracted across borders who aren't permitted to cross. But the majority of people that you have volunteering are amateurs and they're inexperienced. And it means that any kind of skilled work you need to have done is much more difficult to source. This system, I think, is movable to a conflict zone. We have seen this happening inside Ukraine, where individual volunteers are helping people evacuate from Mariupol. They're helping get food into Kharkiv. They're helping get medical supplies into Kyiv. But if the fighting is very heavy, getting things in does require a humanitarian corridor. And those corridors are best negotiated by large international aid agencies. So UNHCR or the International Committee of the Red Cross can do that where individual volunteers cannot. And finally, the biggest problem is a security problem. You know, in a distributed computing system, security is hard because each node as well as each connection has to be secured. And we know that messages and data can get lost in the network while they're moving from one node to another. In the humanitarian system, that problem has much more severe consequences. So at the Hala Kievska, where Ivona and I were, there was a big transit hall where people were just hanging up big maps, France, and volunteers who were willing to drive someone from Winnie to France were taking people into their cars. There was, at least at first, little or no record of who was taking whom where. Eventually a system at the Hala was devised where they were recording people's taking pictures of people's passports, particularly the drivers, but there was no central database of who was going with whom to what place. And of course, there were a lot of worries then about human trafficking, about people who could pick up women and children, who were the bulk of the refugees in this case, and move them to God knows where, and nobody could track them. We don't know for sure that there have been any cases of human trafficking yet. There are no confirmed reports, but certainly the potential was there, and it was very, very concerning. And finally, this system really only handles small problems easily. It can handle a lot of small problems. You need, you know, 1 million shirts. We can come up with 1 million shirts one at a time. But complex problems that involve multiple steps or require a lot of continuity are difficult. So resolving people's visa problems, finding long-term housing, job placement assistance, those are very difficult to handle. And while you can help individuals quite easily, helping institutions is another story. So you can move individuals, but it's much harder to move an entire symphony orchestra. You can move 1,000 individuals, but moving an entire university is much more difficult on a volunteer driven system. So for example, Central European University right now is trying to organize a university in exile, the invisible university, but that's very difficult. I know Kharkiv University is also trying to reorganize itself in exile, but finding someone to provide the institutional space for that and the salaries for so many people is very difficult. So finally, I'm just showing you some more pictures of aid at the border. This is the slide that I feel very strongly about. You know, one of the things we worry about in this response is that it's very much anger driven. We call it rage giving in the humanitarian industry. And while it comes at high volume, we also know that it's very often not sustainable over the long term. And so the question is, how long can this volunteer response be sustained? I think we're seeing signs of donations falling off now, of people getting exhausted, their time and their resources are being exhausted. In Poland, there are over 1 million people who are living in other people's homes. And that clearly is not a situation that can go on for months and months. So we don't know how long this can continue on. The long-term ramifications of this system are still not known, I think. You know, we were thinking about the fact that computers used to be huge. You know, the idea at first was that you would produce bigger and bigger computers that had more and more processing power. And today, those big centralized computing systems don't exist very much anymore. And the companies that produce them have gone out of business. So I'm thinking about Silicon Graphics or Cray Computer. These were mega computer manufacturers, but that processing power is now much, much smaller than the distributed power of Google, for example, which relies on distributed computing and which has taken over providing computing services to large institutions like universities. So the question for us is whether this distributed computing is going to have the same, distributed humanitarianism will have the same effect on the international humanitarian system. That is, will distributed humanitarianism end up wrecking large humanitarian actors like UN agencies, rendering them ineffective in the face of large population movements, or limiting them to particular specialized problems, like humanitarian corridors for food distribution? Or will it force these organizations to transform into something different? For example, the UN now is seeing itself as a provider of direct cash transfer that is just moving cash to people on Visa cards or into bank accounts so that they can buy things on an open market themselves. That means the UN is no longer a logistics provider, it's a banker. And that's a profound change in its role. Other aid agencies are now transforming themselves into providers of training. So they're doing a lot of psychosocial aid, and we can discuss the dubious effectiveness of that. So we don't know what effect this kind of mass volunteer activity is going to have on the humanitarian system. I think it does show that we now have to fundamentally transform that system if it's going to be able to respond to events like this at all. And the system itself has shown itself profoundly unwilling to engage in that discussion. We've been talking since the World Humanitarian Forum in 2016 about the ways that the system has to decentralize and localize, and yet it's still less than 10% of aid dollars which are going directly to local NGOs for aid provision, even though they're the most effective and know needs the best. So I think we need a whole new architecture of humanitarian intervention. And one of the things we're doing at my center is trying to reimagine that new architecture of aid. I think we also need to think about what this does to society as a whole. You know, one of the things I saw posted on Facebook from a really savvy Ukrainian commentator, she said, the truth is that we no longer rely on the state, we are the state. And what she means is that by and large, people in Ukraine, people in Poland, people in the surrounding countries, even in very well-developed countries, have come to believe that the state has abandoned them. That's a fundamental tenet of neoliberal state formation, that the state is no longer responsible for providing for the welfare of its citizens. But what's really interesting is that when I started thinking about this problem 30 years ago, the result of state abandonment was very often seen as individualization and social atomization, that each individual was on their own to survive or not in a competitive environment where they had to struggle for resources. And what we're seeing now are groups of people who accept the first tenet of neoliberalism, that the state has abandoned them, but not the second. They don't accept that they are alone. And they're creating these floating, flexible networks of new solidarities that are emerging in the wake of war and disaster. And what the effect is of those new networks long-term, I think, is still to be discovered. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for listening to these thoughts that are fresh out of the field.
Bravo. Thank you, Dr. Elizabeth Cullen-Dunn, for this. And I'd also like to welcome Dr. Ivana Kolashevska, who's now joined us. Welcome, Ivana. Thank you for this. Yes, thank you for this important research. So we actually do have quite a number of questions for you in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and proceed through the questions. Somewhat in the order they are received, but I might skip a few to give everyone a chance to ask the question, or combined a few. So the first question is sort of paraphrasing. I think what you're saying is that the UN is slow to act, which is true for most large or super large organizations. When it comes to the UN, and in the short term, individual local people can react faster, but do they have the capacity for the long term? So this question was preempting some of your critiques about the sustainability of this problem. And then a comment about the UN as a vacuum for huge aid budgets. So thank you to a commenter and one of our audience members who goes by the initials AN for that comment.
Thanks for that. I think the question about whether large organizations can move fast depends a lot on how they're organized. And the UN is extremely highly centralized. But you know, one of the other really effective civil society aid providers in the United States is the Mormon Church. And the Mormon Church runs its own social welfare network. It has farmers who donate food in kind instead of in cash. They're tithing 10% of their income, but they send it as food, and then that food is processed by Mormon volunteers in Mormon-owned food processing factories. That food is sent to the Bishop's Storehouse, which is a Mormon-owned grocery store chain. I mean, there's one in almost every town, but it's not a grocery store because all of that food is given away by the Mormon Relief Society. And the Relief Society is organized at the stake level and then at the level of the individual congregation. And the interesting thing about what is in fact a highly decentralized response, because this food is processed and sent out to the bishop's storehouses as it's produced, so that it's held on site in a widely distributed network. The Mormons have been able to respond more quickly than the Red Cross to most emergencies. If you look at Hurricane Katrina, the Mormons were there first, Walmart was there second, and the US Federal Emergency Management Organization, FEMA, did not arrive for several days after that. So I think it's really amazing that even big organizations that organize themselves as distributed networks can respond pretty quickly. The UN is not that kind of an organization. CARE International is not that kind of an organization. They just don't have a framework where local responders can take those decisions into their own hands and move fast. So You know, I think there's really a question about whether the UN itself could rethink its organization to be a better responder without dissolving itself completely.
Thank you. So our next question comes from Linda Solomon, who asks, how do organizations like Doctors Without Borders or World Central Kitchen fit into this model? Are they equally slow to respond to the UN? I think we kind of heard a bit about this.
One?
Oh, okay. Yep. So I think World Kitchen was the only one that was actually present, not from the first day, but they were still there from the week second, as far as I remember. And they did cooperate. The difference was that they had paid workers, and the other volunteers, they were all unpaid, and they were doing that with their own money. I think Elizabeth, you were talking about the community female organization, how it translated into English. So that was the basic difference. But they were there 24 hours a day, so, or at least as long as the border crossings were open. So they fit into the picture without sort of smoothly. I think each organization that really wanted to be in was let in. So the system was really open, like the volunteers. When I'm asking about the first days, how did it all start? They say like, well, we just welcomed everybody who wanted to help. And so that was the case with the Central Kitchen, if that answers your question. Do you want to add something, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that makes Doctors Without Borders or World Central Kitchen really different than, say, the UN organization or HIAS or Care International is their relationship to the state. So both of them have a model where they have a prepackaged kit, a prepackaged set of services they're going to deliver. Many of them, or I think both of them, actually have like shipping containers already packed. So Doctors Without Borders will pack an entire hospital into a shipping container, which it then can move overseas and set up very quickly, but it has no connection to the local health system. So, or to local hospitals or to local doctors. It's just this artifact that arrives almost like from outer space and sets up. And World Central Kitchen is like that too. They ship in their own equipment. They have paid volunteers and coordinators. They come in and they operate independently of the state. UNHCR operates very differently. It works in concert with and at the invitation of nation states, which I think means that you have two mega bureaucracies then to contend with. And I think the big international NGOs also try and operate in concert with the state. And in many cases, what they try and do is take over the role of the state in welfare provision. So when I've talked to Church World Service, or I've talked to HIAS was another group that I've spoken with, or I talked to Care International, they say that a lot of what they do is quote unquote advocacy. So direct aid provision they're doing by funneling money to local NGOs, they're subcontracting. But what they bring to the table is advocacy, which means in many cases telling the government how to alter itself in order to be the aid provider. And these organizations, in fact, take over the role of the state by going inside the state and dictating at the ministerial level what kinds of changes will be made in terms of law and policy, and what kinds of aid will be provided. We certainly saw this in Georgia, where like UNICEF had taken over the Ministry for Children, Health and Welfare. So this idea that aid agencies do advocacy and consulting, that they become replacements for the state, I think is really problematic, because many states now are resisting having them enter precisely because they try and take over state functions. And so what we're seeing is a lot of conflict between major aid organizations and host states for refugees who don't want them in there precisely because they limit state sovereignty.
Thank you. What important nuance, and this expertise really adds so much to how we understand what's happening and where things are getting tripped up. And it also relates to the next question from Lydia Kuziemska, who asks, why were UNHCR and other agencies caught unprepared if there were consistent reports in the Western media, including US intelligence reports, that the Russian invasion in Ukraine is highly probable and even imminent? What is the UNHCR WFO's decision-making process for getting ready for upcoming emergencies? Or are they typically reacting after an emergency began? And also a thank you for the talk.
Thank you, Lydia. I wish I had a good answer for this question, because it's not just that they had weeks of warning, it's that they had 14 years of warning. Ever since the Russian invasion of Georgia, it has been very clear that the Russian state is expansionist, that it is unwilling to let territory that was part of the former Soviet Union become a NATO ally. That's been said openly. And it's been very clear that military action against those states, which were mentioned in the Budapest Declaration as, one day these countries will be part of NATO. That declaration was made 14 years ago. So why have we waited so long to see this coming? Because it's been imminent ever since then. 8 years ago, the Russians took Crimea and they invaded the Donbass. So that should have been a red flag that there was the possibility of a larger scale invasion, and yet there was still no response. Then we had these intelligence reports starting months before this current invasion that an invasion was imminent, still no response. We had Russian military massing at the border, still no response. I don't understand why it has been so difficult for those of us who have been watching Putin for 14 years and saying he's dangerous, this is really dangerous. Why it's been so difficult for us to get any traction, not just from the aid community, but from the US government or the German government. I can't tell you why that's true. I can tell you that in the United States, getting any response has been very difficult because at the governmental level, there have been two responses. One has been just attention focused elsewhere. The idea that the real danger was militant Islam. And the other idea that we heard was, if you think the Russians are dangerous, it's because you're a Cold War holdover, because you're a boomer. I cannot tell you how many times I've been accused of being a boomer, although I am 20 years too late for that. So the idea that the Russians, that the Russian expansionist state posed a danger is seen as a Cold War legacy and not to be taken seriously. And I think that notion blocked a lot of people from seeing how dangerous this was. And look now, the Russians have been sitting in South Ossetia, inside Georgia, for the last 14 years. They have an entire army base there, the 58th Army. They could occupy Tbilisi in under an hour because they are less than a kilometer away from the East-West Highway. And yet there are zero preparations either for a humanitarian response to that or to some sort of military response for that. No one takes that possibility seriously when I think it's entirely realistic. So I don't know. I feel very much like a Cassandra. Sorry, Cassandra. I feel very much like a Cassandra these days saying that I told you so, but I don't know why we haven't been able to get response for this.
Thank you. Ivana, would you like to contribute to this response as well?
No, I'm okay.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for this important perspective. And I have to admit that although my first name is Cassandra, I was not predicting this at all. Although, once it was in the news, it did seem quite inevitable. So I share that questioners' sort of surprise and as well as your outrage. So thank you for that. I'll now combine a few questions coming up next, and these have to do with a sort of question about perhaps the bias or specificity of this particular distributed humanitarianism that we're observing. First, we have a sort of critique of the UN, a big stealing machine and a vacation plan for their third world staffers. But more specifically, would this system work in a third world country? And so we heard a bit from you about that, but I think it's an important question if we're thinking about the UN transforming. And then also, John Hollian asks, would the Polish response have been different if the refugees were from an African country? And I think we have some highly relevant examples to delve into with that. So I'll turn it over to both of you with this set of questions.
Yeah, I think that this is an important question in a number of ways. I think that the response of solidarity with incoming refugees in the global South has been wildly underestimated, actually. And there are a number of academics studying these South-South humanitarianisms and finding out that, in fact, there's an enormous amount of support, both state-led and volunteer-led, for people from the global South in the host countries where they land in the global South. So I'm thinking here quite a lot about Lebanon, where in Lebanon, 1 of every 4 people in Lebanon is a Syrian refugee. And overwhelmingly, the burden for caring for those refugees and keeping them alive and getting them jobs and getting them some kind of reasonable housing has fallen on Lebanese people themselves, because the international community's response has not been adequate to that job, because the Syrian exodus was so many people. I think 11 million people. I could be off on that. It could be 14. Turkey, for example, Turkey alone is hosting 4 million people. And the overwhelming response has not been from the Turkish state. It's been from individual Turks. So do I think this? I think this is working in countries in the global South, although perhaps not at the volume or the financial level that it's working inside Europe. I think for many, many years, responsibility for refugees has been based on what we call responsibility by proximity, which is the country nearest to the conflict gets to deal with it. You know, that this happened to Poland is the fact that Poland is taking this many people is not an artifact of Ukrainians being white. It's an artifact of Ukrainians being next door. So Poland is getting hit with responsibility by proximity in the same way that Turkey got hit during the Syrian crisis. And like in all of these crises, the nearest country bears the brunt of the burden of response. As to whether we'll see the same response if the refugees themselves are non-white, I think that's a really complicated question that you can't answer well through the lens of US or Western European ideas about race. And I'll tell you why, because I think in the United States we have a racial framework which is divided into white and not white. And so it's easy to say, well, if Syrians are being turned back by the Poles, which they were, thousands of them being turned back at the Belarusian border for months, it's because they're not white. But the situation is in fact much more complicated. Those refugees were weaponized by Belarus. They were invited by Belarus. Their transportation from Syria was arranged by Belarus. And the object was to impose a burden of care on the European Union, which would give Belarus some kind of power to act as a gatekeeper, much like Turkey has been. And Turkey has made a lot of money from the European Union by being its gatekeeper. So there are regional politics involved. There are questions of cultural similarity and affinity involved. So Poles, I think, feel that they are more culturally familiar with Ukrainians because they, their languages are not mutually comprehensible, but sort of, I don't know, 30%, Ivana, 40% is somewhat comprehensible. They share culinary customs, they share family making patterns. So they're more culturally familiar to one another. There is also the notion, which we heard all over Poland, where Poles were saying, hey, we're helping the Ukrainians out of self-interest because they're what stands between us and Putin. And the mayor of Warsaw has said that. I think the quote was, we're helping the Ukrainians because they're saving our ass. And that's completely true. I mean, if you don't think that the Ukrainian fighters are the only thing keeping Putin out of Poland, you're crazy. So Poles see this as very self-interested. So would they have the same response to Syrians? No, because the Poles have less to lose based on what happens in Syria. They don't have a consequence for not helping the way they do here. And so I really avoid thinking about this in terms of racism, and I'd rather think about it in terms of geopolitics, because I think it is that. I also would say that this is an issue of religion and widespread Islamophobia over the last 20 years, which has been mobilized by the American government, the German government, the Polish government for political gain, plays a much bigger role in the Polish response to Syrians than I think race does. So it is a multi-factored problem, not just a race question.
And if I may add something, I think to what you said, there is also a gender factor. Like I talked to people who were helping Nigerians, like on the other side, on the Ukrainian side of the border. And well, they went there and they were like, okay, we can transport somebody, take somebody out of the queue and bring him or her to Poland. And then they would have to choose between 20-year-old Nigerians and mothers with infants. So these people who were there actually to help Nigerians finally ended up taking mothers and infants, because they just thought that the 20-year-old Nigerian can wait. So there was more of a gender and care issue than actually an actual race thing. And this problem, I think it's been a little bit overblown by BBC, because not only have we not met any person of color or any Black person at the border, but also like for the majority, except for Nigerians, their embassies took care of them. So it was a sort of big deal at the very beginning, but it was for a short time, and it was being managed by volunteers as well. So we shouldn't forget about the gender issues. There were usually men from Nigeria and women and kids from Ukraine. So it makes some sense to help the women and kids first.
Yeah, and I would also add there were in the beginning also bureaucratic issues. So while the Polish government had allowed anyone with a Ukrainian ID card or a Ukrainian passport in Ukraine that had to be evacuated. So when they first hit the border, the border guards themselves did not know if they were permitted to admit them. And since there was no immediate danger at the border, they were held there. But I have talked to several people, a couple of people from Congo, a couple of people from Nigeria, and they have reported that they were really helped in Poland. Many of them are now in Germany waiting to figure out where to go next, and they're being supported there as well.
Thank you for this, again, very nuanced take that helps clarify some sort of knee-jerk reactions in the mainstream media that perhaps didn't have this level of nuance. And I'll also jump in here if I may, because it kind of reminds me of something that I was thinking as you were describing this rage-giving or anger-driven giving to humanitarian causes. I wonder, one of the problems with computer systems is that they sometimes don't account for the bias of the users. So is there a sort of, perhaps potential other shortfalling of the system, which is that there may be some kinds of refugees who are more, whose situation provokes more rage from those potential donors than others?
Yeah, I think that that's clearly true, that people have different emotive responses. And part of it has to do also with personal connections. You know, the amazing thing in Poland, there were 1.8 million Ukrainians in Poland before the war. And many of them have taken over sort of healthcare jobs, domestic worker jobs, restaurant work. But the upshot was that many of them were personally known by Poles. I mean, they had friends who were Polish, they had employers who were Polish. And so I think some of the early help flowed along those lines of personal connection. And certainly one of the things I saw here in the United States was the Ukrainian diaspora coming into action very, very fast, again, to help people with whom they had a personal connection. And that's certainly less true of Syrians in Poland. Like, how many Syrians are there? How many Syrians have personal connections in Poland? Probably a lot fewer than Ukrainians. How many Nigerians have personal connections in Poland? So those kinds of pre-existing networks along which aid could flow didn't exist before the crisis.
Yes, thank you. That's very helpful. And I'm also imagining not only the users' biases, but the designers of the system's biases. You know, we hear all that about how social networks reproduce bias, but I've seen similar kinds of processes unfolding for specific interest groups, right? So I've seen LGBTQ activists funneling funds to local LGBTQ NGOs who are then helping, Polish NGOs are helping Ukrainian NGOs and partnering together. Same with disability advocacy and disability-led services. So we have disability activists helping disability activists in Ukraine evacuate disabled folks. So I think there's something that actually is quite flexible here in terms of accessing people with that sort of lived experience lens that the Fortis system that you're describing perhaps might not provide because of that person-to-person and direct network-to-network connection.
Yeah, and we haven't, you know, these affinity networks have been super powerful. And I know, like, I have a friend, Sarah Phillips, who teaches here at IU, who is active in the disability community. And she connected me with some of her disability activist friends, and we were able to funnel money along that chain to them. I think we don't know yet who falls outside the affinity network. Certainly there is a huge population of people who are less computer networked, who are not English speaking or Polish speaking, who don't have contacts outside the country. And those people may be the people who are getting left out of some of these networks along which aid is mobilized. So, you know, finding out who gets excluded, I think, is really going to be important. One thing we do know, speaking of racism, though, that there is one group that has been profoundly excluded from aid. And I think, Ivana, you're the one that had the personal experience with this. Maybe you can talk about it.
Okay. Yeah, so it's Roma people that I forgot to mention with the last question. And if somebody falls out of the networks, it's not the people that don't have connections or don't speak Polish or don't speak English. It's been managed. There's Google Translate. There are a lot of people who don't speak Polish. Some of them do not, well, like older people also don't speak Ukrainian. That's another big deal. Like everything here is offered them either in Polish or in Ukrainian, but there's quite a big majority of Russian speakers. So, but okay, that's not such a big deal, but there are Roma people. And the problem with Roma people is that, well, first, people are not that willing to take Roma people home for different prejudices that are behind the group. And of course, there have been always also some incidents that were kind of confirming the prejudice, which of course always happened. But you know, if in Ukrainian steals something out of the warehouse, well, okay, it happens. But if Roma person does it, then it's the Roma people still here in our warehouse. So that's one thing. And another thing is that they always want to go in big groups. So who would take 80 Roma people? So Ukrainians are more individualized. They would like 2 people with a dog, 2 people with 2 kids. So you have nuclear families that are being managed by nuclear Polish families, but who wants to take 80 Roma people? So so the prejudices are at play here, but also the way the Roma people are living in their communities, the way they want to be together, the way they want to function within their groups. So that's making this distributed aid a little bit difficult. And also they have less connections. So they use them less. They are not looking for jobs as actively as Ukrainians are. So there are differences. When you ask volunteers who have been there in these reception centers since the beginning of the war, they say like, well, yeah, but these Roma people do not even look for a job here. They're just okay being here, although they're supposed to be here for 3 days. So there are these issues at play that will cause a problem, and that they have to be dealt with something, but I think they're not dealt with sufficiently because we don't have such a big Roma population, so we don't have enough Roma organization to address that problem. And I think either European Roma organization should step in, or it should be managed somehow. It is happening, but I think it's not happening enough because Roma people are the last to leave the shelters, temporary shelters. So, yeah.
Thank you. What an important perspective about the local sort of ethnic prejudices that perhaps fall out from that international media perspective. Unfortunately, we only have about 3 minutes left. We have 3 remaining questions, which I'd like to share now. And if we have just a minute to respond, apologies to those who we don't have as much time to devote to your excellent questions. Dr. Peter Kabachnik writes, thank you, Elizabeth, for a great talk. I have one question and one comment. Does this signal a shift from Fordist humanitarianism to digital? Or is it more of a fracturing of the current system, opening up different channels? What I mean is, does this distributed humanitarianism manage to work primarily because these are white refugees and camps will remain dominant when other refugees from the global south are the principal people involved? And then second, my comment is simply that the UN International Humanitarian Network and supply chains and the problems you pointed out seem to parallel the issues the Russian military is having keeping their soldiers supplied. Isabel LeMay writes, is another challenge of volunteer-driven responses that it is dependent on perceptions of the displaced and racialized groups may not benefit from the same level of sympathy. So addressing some of the issues we've just brought up. Irina Nikorici, can we stop screen sharing, please? Okay, thank you very much. And apologies, yes, we were showing the screen, which was a billboard of the obscene swear against the Russian warship attacking the Ukrainian islanders on Snake Island. Okay, and then finally, one last question, Michal Shishkolski, sorry, slow on my Polish alphabet today. Thank you for your observations, interesting presentation, and your warm words addressed to the Polish society. However, I think that your presentation, you are omitting long-term support from the Polish government for Ukrainian refugees. The government has quickly adopted the relevant laws that enabled Ukrainians to set up their own businesses, start work quickly, opened up the access to education for children and students, as well as the access to healthcare free of charge. This is evidenced by numerous thanks included in the Ukrainian government and President Zelensky. We cannot say the Polish government remains passive. Thank you everyone for your questions and comments. I'll turn it back to our panelists for a brief response.
Yeah, I think Peter Kabachnik's question about or comment that this parallels some of the issues that the Russian military is facing shows us, again, that this is a problem of global supply chains. And I think one of the things that we're finding out is that very, very long supply chains, which have been characteristic of the last 20 years, are no longer particularly sustainable in any industry. And that includes the military and humanitarianism, as well as, consumer goods. So certainly we're talking about globally a reworking of logistics and of supply chains, and this is part of that larger problem. I appreciate the comment about the response of the Polish government. The Polish government certainly, and I know Ivana will have something to say about this. The Polish government has definitely done a lot to allow people to pass into Poland. And you're right, we have not credited them with opening the Polish educational system, which has been big. because there are a lot of kids who've been moved into schools very quickly. And they have opened the Polish health system. Although I'm not convinced that this is going to happen in the long term without external funding, because it's quite expensive. But what they haven't done is provide housing or food or clothing. I mean, these immediate needs were not met by the Polish government. So, you know, the role that the government will play in a long-term sustained response clearly is going to be more and more important, and how much that will be supported behind the scenes by the European Union, although the Germans may feel a bit resentful about offering help to Poland, given how much Poland helped them with the Syrians, which was none. You know, I think we'll see some support from the EU, and we'll see some support from UNHCR, perhaps through government channels, since that's been a way that they are doing it. I just wanted to circle back to one other, well, Ivana, why don't you take this one, and then I had one last thing to say.
Oh, okay. Well, I agree what you said. So, of course, the government has to be credited with opening a job market quickly. So, like giving this identity numbers, well, in a more or less okay way, but they stepped in and they were preparing for that. But of course, the preparation was like that, and the needs were like that. So if it wasn't for the volunteer response in the first 2 weeks, because the government, except for firefighters and these local communities, has stepped in pretty late, and sometimes it has helped with the volunteers' work, and sometimes it has actually disturbed it. So there are different cases that I will not go into because that's too complex for the last 2 minutes. So yeah, so that's about the government, but some credit has to be given. That's without question. Thank you.
Hey, I just wanted to circle back last to one thing that Peter Kabachnik asked, which is it that there are going to be different channels where this distributed humanitarianism operates for white refugees or European refugees, and in the global South, camps are dominant? I do not think so. I think the age of the refugee camp is over forever. And we know now that the overwhelming majority of refugees in the world do not live in camps, they live in cities. And many refugees now are refusing to enter camps, and for good reason. You know, they know that eventually in a camp, you'll spend down all your resources, you won't be able to work, you won't be able to earn more, and then you're stuck. The average length of stay in a refugee camp now is 17 years. If you enter what is supposed to be a temporary solution, you on average will stay 17 years. And refugees know that, and they are refusing. So I think increasingly we're seeing the urbanization of refugee populations. And that too means that the ways in which aid is distributed to them has to change, because handing out what I call cots and pots, you know, humanitarian supplies is no longer a long-term solution. You can't hold people in camps and make them dependent on World Food Program deliveries for 17 years anymore. So I think camps are done forever.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Let's all offer a hearty round of applause to our panelists, Dr. Elizabeth Cullen-Dunn, Professor of Geography and Director of the Center for Refugee Studies at Indiana University Bloomington, and Ivana Kalashevska, Assistant Professor at the Institute of Ethnology and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Warsaw. It has been a wonderful and absolute pleasure hearing your important research and insights today. This is so essential to understanding what's happening next, and what an amazing perspective. So thank you, and thank you to all of our audience members for your excellent questions and your participation. We are at time. We do have some suggestions from series of places you might like to donate if you yourself are seeking humanitarian avenues that our support staff will put in the chat now. Thank you again to our wonderful CIRA staff, Larissa and Olga, for supporting this. Thank you everyone for coming today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Goodbye.